2014, Elite Dangerous launches with mild success and applause from not only franchise fans, but garnered outside casual player interest, which is where this Latvian dead horse beater comes in. Skip nearly 10 years later, and the game is reaching the lowest player numbers ever since it was added to the Steam. But the reason why this is so interesting is that only 2 years back, the game was set to reach new heights, and things were looking up more than ever. Today, however, in Google Trends and nearly any other statistic you can find, you can see massive decrease in interest. And dedicated creators, myself included, have in mass abandoned the game that once was one of the best space sims. Today then, let's take a look at the failures of Elite Dangerous, and together maybe we can spot the reason why, unlike its peers, No Man's Sky, Star Citizen and X4, Elite Dangerous has failed to retain its player base. Now, clearly, it escapes me not the fact that I've done a few mad rambling rants on the topic of Elite Dangerous and its shortcomings or decline, and of course, feel free to check those out as well. Every single one of them has something unique in them. However, today I wanted to go over a few, frankly obvious reasons why Elite failed to compete with its competitors, failed to retain its players, failed to simply be a great game, and slowly is withering away into obscurity as a mildly good one, and maybe could still be saved. Now, to help us identify the key failures, I think it's prudent we take a look at the game's history. 2014, December. Elite Dangerous launches to a decent to good reception from veteran players. It looks modern, plays well, and most importantly is comparable to any other game on the market. This is important to note because majority of space sims, the games where you fly a spacey ship and do things, tended to have controls, to put it mildly. No, not intuitive or comfortable controls, but just any kind of control. The reason why, even today, Elite is received well is because of careful, modern approach to user interface and experience. The one thing that attracted me to Elite was the depth in which you can control and interact with your ship. It was complex, yet not complicated. The sort of thing you want from a more hardcore game to bite into. Also, of course, addition of VR, however little, amplified the game's immersion, and to this day is even mentioned everywhere. Of course, reviewers quickly pointed out 3 big problems with the game. Elite is mile wide, inch deep. This mostly goes to the story as well as the vastness of the galaxy that has barely anything in it. And of course, Elite is unbalanced and grindy, both of which go hand in hand. However, these problems could be overlooked at the time for the prospects of genuinely immersive experience that you could simply not have anywhere else. For the time being, these problems, while irritating after 100 hours, you would still have to play those 100 hours. Right? A year later, in 2015, massive changes arrived for the game in the form of Horizon's Season Pass, now expanding the game's play space to half of the planets that you can land and drive on. It felt like a further step towards the real universe, with more than just pretty vistas. Developers promised a lot of content, yet very little of it was actually mentioned. These promises were sparking hope regardless, considering the delivered content before. However, this is where we could see another failure of the game. Frontier developments and their tendency to trend chase, what other companies did at the time. Microtransactions? Boom! Got 'em! CQC competitive gameplay thing? Of course we have to have it! Season Pass content delivery? Yep, that too! And yet the very next failure stemmed from this very soon after. The lack of delivery. Despite the quote-unquote content and updates coming every 3 months or so like clockwork, the size, impact, usability, fun, and most of all quality dwindled with every delivery. Additionally, while I would not count this as a main failure, exploration gameplay truly showcased how empty the game even to this day is. Also, in this time, the previously mentioned problems of grind and game balance got exacerbated to unimaginable degree, thanks to engineering. Still, it was all fresh, and the positives often dazzled players far more than negatives could bring the mood down. Horizons offered so much in the way of breaking the game in a positive way, well, for the players of course, that it didn't really matter that something like, let's say, a healing beam was overpowered, or that you had to grind hundreds of hours just to get these upgrades. And then, of course, the Targoids came. The mythical aliens that were rumored but never spotted. They hinted at a real story finally taking place in the game, but as we'll see, it could have just as well had the opposite result. Now, we skip a few years in 2018 when Horizons finally is over and beyond, a leftover content from Horizons is loosely being injected into the bone marrow of the game to tide the hungry players over till the next big thing. During the time of Horizons, not only the content decreased in its quality and size, but also developer interaction with the player base. Players started recognizing the lack of developer involvement in the community in general, especially when it came to addressing issues and problems that had built up. By now, even the new players realize how empty the game world actually is for Elite. No Man's Sky had released a little while back, and while it was the bedshitting of the decade, its planets put Elite's measly random spawning rocks to utter shame. Now, well and truly, Elite was inch deep, mile wide. But despite the major problems, there was still hope. What would be the next big thing that Frontier is working behind those closed doors? With the Targoid combat launching at the end of Horizon Season Pass, the game finally had some sort of a late game with genuinely well-balanced gameplay, so for now, that would tie people over, right? At this point, however, the player base had well and truly recognized that despite the upgrades and cool gear, the game is increasingly grindy, while developers did very little to address it. Similarly, technical problems became more and more common with every update, and since Elite runs on the in-house engine called Cobra, this would also end up being a critical failure for things to come. Then, after ever-increasing lack of content, developer presence, and basically a maintenance phase for the whole game where nothing happened for a while, in this live service game, in 2020, news for the next big update finally appeared. The long-awaited rumored Space Legs would grace Elite Dangerous. To this day, I maintain the opinion that it was the right decision and direction Elite took, but we'll talk about that. Because a year later, Odyssey released and, well, there's no other way to say it, but it was a clusterfuck of a shitfest. Arguably, this one release alone killed the game and was the biggest failure that snapped the camel's back, and then tried to sell us the rotting flesh. During this time, already established problems got displayed again and again, most notably the lack of developer involvement and participation in the community. And then we are here today. While asking around, I often get the answers that, oh well, new content would have saved the game, new ships, I want new ships, it's boring otherwise. And you know, that's incredibly idiotic statement. Do you really think that another copy-paste ship would really improve the game? Really? No, today, 2 years after the disastrous release of Odyssey, the final failure of Elite, sadly, is the Targoids. Or rather, the continued focus to deliver Targoid gameplay is the reason why Elite is not recuperating, despite the content itself actually having nothing wrong with it, sometimes even being genuinely atmospheric. So then, these are the 9 failures of Elite Dangerous. Maybe your list is different to mine, so why not toss a comment below and let's see what you think. However, while making this list, I did notice that many issues that I would first think of being the big problems often are actually symptoms rather than the problems itself. Even today's list seemed to have a few of them in there, so how about we take a look at each. Right from the get-go, Elite Dangerous was criticized for its immense grindiness, meaning incredibly simple and often boring gameplay loops that you either consciously or unconsciously do to just get that bigger, better ship. But that's how most games operate if you water them down, right? Well, in Elite, first, nearly every action will take you at the very least of 10 minutes on average minimum. Go from starport to starport, even in the same system? 10 minutes. Take your ship and land on a planned surface? 10 minutes. So even doing innocuous super simple missions will pile up on time quickly. And boy, Elite is filled with very simple, meaningless and very often boring, randomly generated ad nauseum missions. And this, sadly, is the consequence of vast play space that Elite decided to have. But then, do the best paying missions. And yes, that's true. That's what most of my more popular videos are all about. Yet even then, the mindless back and forth becomes a grind, just so you can get to the starting position of the activity, gameplay you choose to do for fun. I've talked a lot about this topic and reasons why it exists, but the thing you can't fault games that deliberately take and make their games into a grind fest is that it works. See, grind often is something that players don't realize doing when rewards are just good enough and no better. It works perfectly to extend the gameplay from couple of minutes to literal hours, if not days. If there's one thing I've realized while covering Elite Dangerous and its game design, it's that actually, grind is a good thing. Well, it's good for making quote-unquote gameplay and giving that false sense of game's depth. After all, it is the #1 reason why any of you are playing Elite Dangerous for as long as you do. Yes, we all dislike it, and yes, it's objectively a lazy substitute to actually varied, planned, and progression including gameplay. But grind works, and it is the reason why even today people are still playing the game. However, grind is a triple-edged sword. Even aside from objectively measurable lack of gameplay and design value, what grind also produces is boring gameplay. When you, instead of making interesting missions and solid progression with varied gameplay loops, choose to pump out a game full of meaningless, simple, and highly repetitive gameplay loops for little rewards, expecting the players to jump through all of these boring hoops, well, then there's no wonder when inevitably the players have had enough. They will remember the game only as a boring slog, even if there were genuinely good bits. You are trading quality for quantity, and while it works to keep people grinding away, when they've had enough, they rarely have positive feelings left once they switch off, and then thus never returning. After all, Elite has incredible immersion, cool spaceships, one of the best space combat mechanics, but do I really want to go again and spend hundreds of hours to grind out even portion of that gear just to get to that actual gameplay bits I want? So here we are today. Even if there is good endgame content, like say, motherfucking Targoid Mothership, to get to it, there's a lot of tedious and most of all boring, often unrelated grind you got to go through. So no wonder when old players never come back and new ones can't muscle through the layers of this rotten onion just to get through the exciting bits. And you know, I'm reminded of many MMORPGs. They're still fun to play from level 1 to the end game with inclusion of the grind. But Elite? No, in all honesty, I can't say that. The story. When I claim Elite Dangerous does not have a story or that it's as good as a roadkill, what I mean by that is presentation. Sure, Elite has lore and even ongoing stories that have happened through the years, but you see, the stories that appeared or were attempted by developers all failed spectacularly hard. For example, in Galnet, the in-game news, one day you read that some terrorists have committed, 10 9/11s in some popular space station. You go visit that and nothing. No missions for relief effort or story quests or unique details, not even visual scars inside or outside the station. This was, and still is, Elite Dangerous. And speaking of quests, in my time nearly begged developers, even face to face, to implement what RPG games used decades ago: story quests and quest chains. Yet all of it has fallen on deaf ears, almost to a point that game designers for Elite refuse point blank, for whatever misguided reason, to even consider this. Even despite the fact that game itself features randomly generated chain missions, which are just random missions that are linked with a different icon, that's it. My favorite suggestion from back in the day was do a beginner guide, like a story questline. You see, for a long time Elite Dangerous really didn't have a good tutorial, and still, well, kinda doesn't, but the idea was, present the new players with a simple questline through which the player is introduced to the game and its gameplay, while at the same time, the story elements are being sprinkled in, introducing the world of Elite Dangerous. Say Mission 1. Undock and go to Station X, a simple data courier mission for, say, Alliance. During this mission, you get told about this faction, what they stand for, and how this info you're carrying could help something. Then for the next mission you have to do a cargo transit, and suddenly you get stopped by federal police. You learn about the cargo missions themselves, the Federation and its motivation, and well, perhaps consequences of transporting something a little bit less legal. You see how cool this sort of exposition could be blended in with making the player learn and appreciate the lore with the gameplay, while building also potentially an ongoing story. Yet, I guess that's too rich for Frontier, that's too reasonable. They definitely know better how to make a game, right? And the story of Elite Dangerous basically ends up being a massive expository drivel, where the player is just an observer. Yes, you can participate in those community goals, but fuck you if you think you or your group matter. You're there to observe this garbage fanfiction level of bad world building by the world's most pathetic and arrogant dungeon master. And it's basically like every player sat down to listen to some sort of furry manifesto. If there was real story in Elite, at least the new player retention would be higher, and players would have a reason to come back and replay historic missions. But no, Frontier know how to game design. The balance. Oh, the topic I've examined a lot, gone into the details and made literal hours of tirades for it. But my general takeaway about this topic is that Elite failed to simply update itself to meet the new additions to the game, as in re-examination of how guns, ships, economy and more work together with the new features being there in the game world. Even the grind is a sort of a symptomatic result of developers not balancing the economy properly. However, the grind failure goes beyond that of just pure poor balance. Now, as for the nebulous term of balance and the failure of it, it's basically the developers' persistent refusal to re-examine their own game while continuously piling on more stuff. And then no wonder when for years you still have broken heatsink resupply, why engineering not only is a grind but also produces legitimately game-breaking ship builds, both overpowering and underpowering, why there objectively are worse and best ships, and so much more. A simple thing like a balance patch is basically alien in Elite Dangerous. Now, because of my frustration with this topic, I've been an advocate of extreme levels of balancing, like deletion of engineering entirely, until you can rebalance and make it more fun. And the reason I fixated on this subject of balance so much in the past was that it could make even this inch-deep, mile-wide game at least fun to play, with right and most importantly simple value changes that any developer could make in a day. You could transform Elite Dangerous into far more easy to play, yet just as depthful game, without losing any of the hardcoreness. The reason why some players don't want to return to the game often is how overpowering engineering ships are, especially in open play. Why open play itself is literally just a playground for tryhards who have sat there grinding materials for literal weeks, if not months, which in turn kills the multiplayer experience completely. If Warframe and Stellaris has taught me something, is that rebalancing is not a sign of bad game design. It's an initiative from developers to show that they are still active in the game, that they still see how things need to change for the modern day. Sure, Warframe and Stellaris have both fucked up at least a balance pass or two, but that's okay. Change is good, and there is no better way to make your game better for everyone than taking a step back and re-examining the foundation along with the new stuff. However, Frontier almost never have done this. Elite Dangerous is unique in this regard. Developers almost adamantly refuse to release any kind of balance pass except for the latest feature, and even then for the very surface level stuff on the first weeks. This frustrates me to no end. How? How could you say that your game is so perfect that it does not need a balance pass ever in the 10 years time? Are you seriously sniffing your own farts, or give zero fucks to say that it needs no balance passes? This lack of, frankly, accountability not only makes the game less fair, especially for new players, but also showcases the confidence, or rather blind arrogance, of the developer team. So, tell me, would you really want to play a game where you know it's not fair and developers don't give a shit? Now, after doing my hypercritical reviews, I tried pointing out a certain modus operandi for the development team and its planning committees. As I examined Horizon Season Pass, more and more became clear of how Elite Dangerous operated as a product. It all started in 2012. Star Citizen gets announced and garners loads of attention, sparking a literal resurrection of space sims. At the time, crowdfunding was gaining popularity with such unproven products, and Frontier jumped on it. It wasn't a bad decision. In fact, it was a great one. During the crowdfunding, all manner of promises were made, notably offline mode, because, the old games had that, and the new thing, multiplayer, and, of course, space legs also got hinted a lot, but that's a story for later. This, however, was an overreach. How could you make a multiplayer game that shares a whole galaxy with an offline mode? Yeah, that didn't make sense, so no wonder they cut the offline mode off. Also, at the time, games as service, the cancerous monetary bullshit practice, gained a lot of attention. It kinda made sense. Well, let's make Elite this perpetual money fake service gathering product, yes. And this is kinda where the problems started appearing. Frontier finally getting out of the quote-unquote work for hire slump, becoming an independent entity, started sniffing the industry bullshit hard. Microtransactions? Put them in. DLCs? Yes, please. Can we also make these DLCs segmented and pre-sell them without telling the customer what they'll get? Fuck yes! Everyone's doing it! Oh, and also everyone's doing competitive matchmaking gameplay like Dota, League of Legends, and CSGO, and more. We need that too. Honestly, I'm surprised at this point they didn't put in loot boxes too. Very early on, it was clear that Frontier as a company tried to emulate other more successful companies with the industry quote-unquote standardized garbage. I still to this day despise cosmetics. They have no place in a paid game. The result of this trend chasing quickly came crashing down when Horizon's development didn't pan out, and instead of 1 year season with 4 updates turned into 2 years plus 1 more with half-baked feature delivery. It seemed that the management overshot the capability of the dev team, and as a result, the lifetime pass holders who shelled out big money for potential DLCs by year 6 only got 1 DLC and some shitty cheap skins as a thank you. And no, I'm not kidding about those. The trend-chasing attitude also led to several aimless features like multicrew or worst of all squadrons and fleet carriers being developed only to check a box on a list. I guess you could say that the failure in content delivery as well as the type of content was the result of poor planning, attempting to act like the other big game companies without realizing what your own product is. And I kinda sympathize. I mean, I make videos and more often than not, they also go the same way. And because the management was huffing and puffing that industry copium so hard it felt like features they wanted didn't make sense, also led to unrealistic expectations. Specifically, CQC and multicrew come to mind. Multicrew especially was the update when something felt off. It definitely was clear that the system was very hard worked on. The coders tried their best to make this thing happen, but because Frontier was trying to act like other corporations, deadlines seemed to have been imposed strictly. So when multicrew released, even to this day, it's the most broken feature of the game. And I suspect that multicrew was the big thing that bogged down the development so much that Horizons went from 1 year delivery onto 2 year plus. Well, whatever was the case, update releases started slowing down more and more with less content in each one until 2019 when the game was catatonic, despite being a live service title, which is lethal. But as luck would have it, Odyssey was being developed behind closed doors, and players thought, okay, well, nearly all developers are working on this next big DLC. That kinda makes sense to see the current game be with no updates. But wait, they still could have released something, couldn't they? And indeed, this was the pattern that would repeat. After Odyssey released, even the development for it, patching and fixing started slowing down rapidly. It's definitely funny looking in the hindsight about this quote, which only was true for about 6 months, after which there was less and less of, well, everything. And today, at most, we get a sniveling update every 3 months that barely does anything. Sure, the game is getting older, it's expected. However, what Frontier failed to do was deliver even the stuff that they promised themselves, if not implied. Multiple SRVs in Horizons? Nope, none of that. Monthly developer recaps? Nope, you get a few months and then when people stop complaining, we'll just fuck off. Now, I hate to point at other games when making critique, but No Man's Sky is a great example for being able to still deliver content when the game is getting very long in the tooth. So this failure is one of trustworthiness and show of capability. I mean, why would you come back to or play a game when developers haven't earned that trust and showcased their capability going forward? Communication. Now, I probably hinted at this before, but the communication between the development team and community was a point of contention too. At the beginning, when back in the day Ed Lewis was a community manager, at least you could say that Elite had some kind of a public presence and even interacted with the community in some amateurish way. As the time moved on, some things improved, or like the better streaming setups and more faces on the screen, but the problems kinda exacerbated. See, one thing is to make a public post for everyone to read, but the whole nother one is to react to it. The problem with Elite Dangerous was, and still is, very much this. Developers and community managers engage in a single-sided conversation. You would hear from development team only when they had something to announce, like let's say an update is coming and that's it. Discussing or responding to problems was never the focus, or even considered. Unless, of course, something bad was to happen. The good old balance problem, as I mentioned, was the result of this. In time, the less content the game got, the less information players received too. It would be sometimes months without actual real information being given to anyone. And when it came to monthly retrospectives, barely any word would be given about the future updates or planned content except for very vague platitudes. And at most what you would get is an empty stream from community managers where some of them don't even know how to play the fucking game. The lack of actual communication as to what's going on and what's coming, or, well, what are you doing to improve this? Hell, even the single-sided conversations that came from these, well, frankly speaking, jackasses was so bad that community organized not once, but twice for an open letter. That's how bad things were. And hell, even us, the creators, decided to extend an olive branch once or twice to motivate communication between the development team and the community in some kind of form, so that we would do the job that the PR and community teams were hired to do. However, all of it was met with empty platitudes, just like the community open letters. The feeling of developers completely ignoring dedicated fans and passionate players is heartbreaking, and this lack of response further insulated the dev team. And then no wonder when they think, oh hey, balancing a game? That's not needed. I don't hear anyone complaining about that, when you're alone in an empty room. Cobra Engine. Now, say what you will about in-house engines, but Elite Dangerous in 2014 was running very well and could be confused for something made on Unreal. Still, when you're making a game on your own platform, be you a DICE on Frostbite engine or Johnny Bobby with your Bobby engine in a cottage, you'll face a certain inevitable wall using your own built shit brick house. Elite Dangerous ran into technical problems during release of Multi-Crew, but even before that, the simple ability of planet generation alone during Horizon's release hinted at deeper problems. The problem with custom in-house engines always watered down to a simple reality. No one knows what the fuck it is. As you bring in new developers, they have to learn not only how game or its structure is built, how the code is written, but also how the engine handles it, and this is the real long-term cost you pay for being able to do things quote-unquote your own way. With the release of Odyssey, it was very apparent how performance-wise alone, Cobra Engine could not handle the new resolution, details and functions of Space Legs, or at least the way they expected the recommended specs to work. That, and of course the general incompetence about the engine. And I don't mean it in a mean way. I'm incompetent about editing most of the time, but I do my best, and so I guess many coders tasked with working on Elite Dangerous. The problem with Cobra engine is also, it's old and it's over bloated. Well, at least the version they're using for Elite Dangerous. So adding new features, especially ones like Odyssey attempted, brought more problems than benefits, which we witnessed on the launch, and of course in Aftermath. I mean, for fuck's sakes, Odyssey is still not optimized to meet the recommended spec standards they themselves set up, and it's been 2 years. The Odyssey, yes, the space legs, the long-rumored and highly anticipated final hurrah of Elite Dangerous ended up being the wrench blow to the proverbial soft skull of David Braben's baby. I've seen a few folks say that it was a mistake through and throughout, but I completely disagree. See, first-person perspective, space legs, that ability to walk around was an obvious next step to expand the gameplay in Elite in so many ways, moving away from vehicle-based gameplay and onto your gameplay. Not feeling like you are the vehicle, but that the vehicle you're flying is just a part of you. Now, what they did was royally fuck it up. Now, I've covered this in extensive detail and everything wrong about it, but in general, the takeaways are simple. Not half-assed, but barely-assed gameplay, focused nearly purely on the combat, exploration is a joke, more grinding engineering stuff for combat, which in of itself is pathetic joke in every way. Of course, let's not forget about the extermination of old planets and discoveries people made on them. And, of course, straight up lies, greed, and corporate culture. Despite the fact that, like the cosmetics apologists, you could say, well, you don't have to buy it or use it, it's still the same game, right? Similarly, the reality is simple. These additions still affect the game, you idiot. Odyssey also showcased the contempt from developers and their mouthpieces towards the community, and their attitudes towards the quote-unquote listening to community. This DLC expansion in a single swift swing not only showcased nearly all of the failures, but forced you to swallow them. Or leave. And sadly, when presented with past fuck-ups, continued instillment of them and warped future direction that you can't put your trust in, very quickly people left. And who can blame them? If this is what Frontier wants for the future of Elite, well then, no thank you. Yeah, but Yamiks, you can still play the same Elite with the same spaceships gameplay. Fuck Odyssey if you don't like it. Well, yeah, like I said with the cosmetics, you can try and ignore them, and to some degree you can, but it doesn't change the fact they're still there. And it also does not change the developers are not changing course. I still recommend Elite Dangerous as a best space sim out there, but that full confidence is no longer there. It's getting harder and harder to enjoy the genuine, great, immersive and complex mechanics of the game when the game is being, well, squandered by its creator. Today though, 2 years past the shitstorm and the lowest point in the player base falling lower and lower, let's do what Americans and British like to do, and blame aliens. Targoid content, in all honesty, is good. Genuinely difficult yet fair and kind of a like boss or raid battles in MMORPGs. So then why am I blaming Targoids as one of the major failures of Elite Dangerous? Well, it's not so much as the idea or design of the Targoids that's at fault, but rather that they are being used as a crutch by the remaining developers since Beyond the series. You see, aside from Odyssey release, even afterwards, every time you get a new update with some kind of content in it, it's almost always Targoid stuff. New anti-Targoid engineered weapons, new anti-Targoid modules, new Targoid to shoot, even newer, bigger, bestest Targoid boy in the world that doesn't even have gameplay yet. And all of it is unlocked through tedious, boring gameplay. Sure, you can use those items in normal gameplay, but most of them really don't even function or do anything. And the weapons, well, they're kinda useless in comparison to normal engineered stuff, so why would you? So it's clearly, purely Targoid-based gameplay. All of these new items and content is for niche, late-game combat gameplay at that. And you don't need to be a statistician to determine that a very small group of players will ever touch this content. And there's nothing wrong in targeting the late game portion of the game as it gets older, and nearly all games that I know of over-focuses on this aspect and fails to address the whole game, especially the new player experience. But really, if you keep on doing this, all that will be left in the community are the most hardcore players. During Beyond series, and even before it, you didn't need a lot of developers to refocus the game and make impactful, quality-of-life updates to bring the game back from the dead. This is the perfect time with such low manpower to make grand changes for the betterment of everyone. However, Frontier, and more so the development team of Elite, has always had this one problem, and its name: stagnation. All of today's failures are indicative of this word. Sure, performance and the engine are fucked and doubtful we'll see improvements on them, but however, majority of the age-old failures you can correct. Elite still can be turned around. I genuinely believe that with thorough and extensive quality of life updates, existing features and content can be turned into gold that once shined. Today, I think people are less impressed with graphics, but more with good gameplay. The success of BattleBit alone proves it, and I do think that Elite, despite being old, can do that too. But maybe my inner self is right and things won't change. I know it's pessimistic, but I've seen this group of chuckle fucks do the same thing for a decade now. Still, what worries me the most is the end-of-life plan for Elite. Will Frontier honor their promise to give some sort of way for customers to run a limited galaxy once they stop supporting servers? Or will they kill the game so that no one can play it ever again? For now, there's of course a little bit more time left away from it, but once the Targoid content runs out in about a year or so, all bets are off. And I, for one, would love to see a comeback, to see the game once more thrive and be full of life. And while we're at it, since Legacy mode will probably be axed sooner or later, maybe put that as an offline capable mode. I do sure would love some mods for Elite one of these days. But until then, I'll keep an eye open and let you know if something positive arises. As always, thank you for listening, and definitely biggest thanks to all the patrons right here, the biggest supporters who make this thing sort of happen. And maybe you too want to toss a potato, so do check out those links down below. And as for you, Frontier, prove me wrong.